Education webinar on leveraging technology to teach Common Core literacy standards. I'm Doug Cavillage, and I'm with McGraw-Hill Education, and I'll be moderating the webinar today. Before we get started, I'd just like to go over a few quick housekeeping items. As you know, this webinar is being presented in listen-only mode, which means you'll be able to hear the presenter, but they won't be able to hear you. However, that doesn't mean you cannot participate. We'll be offering several opportunities to ask questions and interact throughout the webinar. So just type those into the questions panel on your toolbar, and we will address those at the end of the session today. Joining us today is Catlin Tucker. She is a Google certified teacher and Q lead learner. She teaches 9th and 10th grade English language arts at Windsor High School in Sonoma County, where she was named Teacher of the Year in 2010. She has also taught online college level writing courses, which led to her interest in blended learning. Corwin published her first book on blended learning for grades 4-12 in June of 2012, and she also authored a blended learning course for ASCD. She's also co-authored a book titled Creating Your Google Apps Classroom, which was published in June of 2014. She's currently working on her second solo book using technology to teach the Common Core literacy standards. Catlin has published articles in education leadership, On Q, and Teacher Librarian Journal. She's an experienced professional development facilitator, trainer, educational consultant, curriculum designer, and frequent ed tech speaker. She earned her BA in English from UCLA and her English credentials and Masters in Education from UCSB. She writes an internationally ranked education technology blog at catlintucker.com and is active on Twitter at Catlin_Tucker. So Catlin, very excited to have you today. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thanks everyone for being here. So I'm really excited to present this session. I am working, I'm just finishing, actually, it's out for peer review, my newest book, which is really focused on how to use technology to really creatively address some of the Common Core and teach some of the Common Core literacy standards. And if you have any questions that don't get answered today, feel free, you can send me a note at Twitter. I'm really active. I can point you in directions of resources, or you can check out my blog, catlintucker.com, and just post comments there, and I'll make sure I get back to you about any questions you have concerning what we're going to go over today. So I always like to start my presentations and my webinars and my trainings by showing teachers where I work every single day. So I work in a very low-tech classroom. In fact, the only technology hardware that I have in my classroom is a computer on my desk. I do have a student use computer that's on my side counter that I requested from our local computer recycling center. And then everything else that we do is really dependent on the devices that come through my door with my students and their connectivity at home. So my first book was on blended learning, and I very much embraced a blended learning approach to teaching and my curriculum and engaging students. So there's really three parts to my approach to technology integration and blended learning, which are capitalizing on my students' connectivity at home, you know, their computers at home, their ability to get online, and each year more and more of them are able to get online. And for those who don't have easy access at home, don't have reliable internet, or just have too many siblings to get on the computer for the time they need, we have an A-B schedule. So we really, my goal is to get them connected, so letting them know when our library office hours are open for the computer lab and where they can get online in our community. I actually embedded into my class website a Google map, and I dropped pins in all of the places in our community, on our campus, where kids can get online. So hopefully between their A and B day schedule, they can find a computer, get online, and do the pieces of their homework that are their online components that we weren't able to do live in the classroom. The next window is the picture of the the boys actually crowded around a hodgepodge of devices, and that's very much my BYOD. So when students enter my class, I let them know, I tell parents, I write it on the syllabus, I hit it home at back to school night. I welcome any and all devices. If they have an iPod Touch or a smartphone or a tablet or an iPad, bring it in, we'll use it. And so students really have to take the lead in the classroom because I'm not the expert at every device. So I'm a big proponent of using your students as the really valuable resources they are if you're trying to make use of the kind of array of devices they bring into the classroom. And then really my whole goal with embracing blended learning was to create a very student-centered classroom where the focus wasn't on me. I didn't stand at the front of the room disseminating information while they passively consumed it, but rather I wanted them to be really active generators of information. I wanted them sitting in circles and having discussions. I wanted them with devices at the ready where they could research and problem solve and work together. So that's kind of my approach to teaching with this kind of blending of online components with the face-to-face interaction, which is so crucial. And today I'm going to talk about a lot of tools, and that's partly part of my philosophy. So I've definitely kind of embraced the idea of building my teacher tool belt, where I pick up a variety of tools and I use them. And so it's really happened one tool at a time, where I pick something up, I've tried it out, I've made a ton of mistakes, and then I've gotten better at using it with students, and then I've picked up another tool. And what I like about building a tool belt as opposed to just using a single tool is that students really get exposure to lots of different tools, and they can appreciate that different tools do different jobs, and some tools do certain jobs really well, but they don't do other jobs as well, which is it mirrors what life is like, right? There's not one tool that fixes everything in our lives, and the same goes for technology. And so my hope is that throughout the year, as students are exposed to a variety of different tools, they'll start to get a sense for which ones they like, which ones they want to use, and hopefully they won't just be technology literate, which means they kind of know what to do with tools, they know how to use them, but they know when to use them, and they're more fluent. They know why the tool they're using is the best tool for a particular job. So I'm going to highlight several tools in today's webinar, but I'm not suggesting that you try to scoop them all up at once and try to use all of them in your practice. But if one or two sounds really interesting or intriguing, I'd suggest trying it. Know you're going to make some mistakes, and that's okay. And then you can try another one. And if you leave today excited to try just one, I will feel like the webinar has been a success, because it just takes really one experience with one tool and feeling successful with it to really get teachers excited about trying additional tools. So I've kind of broken this up into 3 sections, focusing first on the writing standards, and then on the reading standards, and then shifting to writing standards, and then ending with speaking and listening standards. So there are some key shifts that have happened in the writing or in the reading section in terms of the Common Core. And so I wanted to go over those because I know that the switch for a lot of teachers is really overwhelming from the previous state standards to the Common Core standards. So with the Common Core standards, looking specifically at the reading section, there's a real emphasis on text complexity. And we'll get back to that phrase in a second, because text complexity is really thrown around in the standards quite a bit. And unless you really dig into the appendices, it's not necessarily clear how a teacher like myself can identify a complex text that's a good match for their students. So I think that's important to kind of go over. There's also this idea that we need to start balancing literature with more informational and nonfiction texts. So the Common Core is kind of following the lead of the National Assessment of Education, the NAEP, in requiring kind of an increasing proportion of informational texts. So the idea is that as students progress through kindergarten through 12th grade, they're actually reading a higher percentage of informational text the higher they progress through the grade. So at 4th grade, they really should be reading about 50-50. 50% literary text versus about 50% informational text. By the time they get into 8th grade, that's shifting a bit, where they're reading about 45% literary text and about 55% informational text. And then by 12th grade, they're reading only about 30% of literary text and about 70% of informational text. And the idea is to mirror really the text that they need to be able to read really well when they get into a college or career. And a lot of English teachers, and I can say this because I am an English teacher, get really nervous about this idea of teaching less literary text and more informational text. So I think it's worth stating that this is covering English, language arts, science, history, and technical studies. So yes, we want to balance more informational text with the literature we teach, but those informational texts are being taught in English, history, science, and technical studies, not just in the English classroom. Students need to be able to also build content knowledge by reading really complex texts or through, kind of content-specific nonfiction and informational texts. They need regular practice working with increasingly complex texts as well, so that ultimately they're really independent and proficient readers. One of the issues with kids, kind of the disconnect between when they leave high school and get to college, is there's a lot of hand-holding and scaffolding and work that goes into breaking down text in the classroom, and students don't get that when they go to college. So if they haven't had the opportunity to really struggle with some more challenging texts and break them down and make sense of them, it's going to be very hard to go into a college setting where they're assigned, a large amount of reading that they really do and make sense of on their own. And the way that the standards are broken up is they act like a staircase where each grade really feeds into the next in terms of the skills. So if you just looked at like reading literature standard, the first standard, by kindergarten through second grade, students are simply asking and answering questions about key details in a text that they've either heard, if they are not reading yet, or a text that they have read. By third grade, they're not only asking and answering questions, but they're starting to demonstrate some basic understanding of the explicit meaning of text. By fourth grade, they need to start referencing specific details and examples, start exploring both and learning, okay, this is explicit, this is implicit. Can we start drawing those out of the text, what's explicitly stated versus what's implicitly stated? By fifth grade, they're quoting from a text to explain kind of both explicit and implicit meaning. By middle school, they're citing, they're analyzing, and that's interesting for me to see as a high school teacher, because a lot of my ninth grade students are coming in and they're definitely not able to cite necessarily the strongest evidence, and they're definitely struggling to get past summarizing the plot and telling me what happened to getting into a place where they're really analyzing the text. But if you look at the Common Core, by 9th and 10th grade, they really should be citing strong evidence, really relevant evidence, and supporting that with more developed analysis. And then by 11th and 12th grade, they're really just honing those skills. So you see this really gradual development of reading skills, yet you have some skills happening much sooner than maybe we were used to in the past. Now, the text complexity issue phrase is an interesting one, because there's really three parts to text complexity. And if you look in the Common Core, the appendices of the Common Core, they have a little triangle breakdown of the three parts of text complexity. I am much more a fan of the s'mores breakdown that was created by Tracy Wadenby. I'm not sure how to say her last name, but big fan of s'mores here. So this is the example I'm definitely going to use. So you have the quantitative measures, and the quantitative measures are things like word length, word frequency, sentence length, and these things are almost impossible for a human to really evaluate. So we use things like the Lexile framework in order to measure these things. Then, it spits out a score that's attached to a book, but that's not the whole picture of a book. That's just the word frequency, word length, sentence length. Then you have qualitative measures. And these are things like levels of meaning and purpose, language conventionality and language clarity, how much previous knowledge, experience do students need to understand a text. And a computer can't figure this out. This really should be something that the teacher is evaluating. And then the third component of this kind of three-part puzzle that decides how complex a text is the reader and task. So, what are your students ready for? And what is it you're going to be asking them to do with this reading? Because the task that we attach to a reading is going to make it more or less challenging. So these are the three things you want to consider as we try to determine, is this text complex for my particular group of students? And it's interesting, and I point this out to my own students, that complex texts tend to have certain characteristics in common. They tend to have more implicit meaning, so kids really need to dive under the surface to make sense of what's happening. They tend to employ kind of unconventional structures, so structures that are out of the ordinary for students or more challenging. If there are graphs in a text that are essential to the student understanding the text, so they're not just pretty graphs that look nice, but graphs that are key to understanding what the text is saying, then that tends to indicate that you're reading a more complex text. They tend to assume more previous knowledge on topics, more life experience, and they use a lot more ambiguous, figurative, domain-specific, or archaic language that students might not be as familiar with, so that also makes it more challenging. And oftentimes, the literal meaning is at odds with the deeper meaning, which baffles students why anybody would do this, but it occurs quite frequently in complex text. So just making students aware of, why a text is challenging, and then trying to kind of focus in on giving them some tools so they can make sense of those components is really important for us as educators. And so for a lot of teachers thinking about, okay, I need to teach more informational text, but where do I get these texts? I know that in an English department meeting I was in when we first were hearing about the Common Core, a lot of teachers were fairly put out. They felt like we need an anthology of nonfiction informational text if we're going to make this transition. And yet I was kind of sitting in the background thinking, but we have the internet, we have access to all of this incredible information, all these articles and texts online. We just need to figure out where to go to find texts that we want to use. And so one of my favorite tools or places, web tools that I like to use for this is News ELA. And News ELA is a website that basically takes news articles and rewrites them at various lexile levels. So if you go to News ELA, you'll see that the articles are broken up into different topics like war and peace, or categories: science, money, law, kids topics, art. And so you can choose the category, or you can do keyword searches. You can find an article. You see on the right-hand side that the article can be read at 4 different lexile levels, ranging from the top end at 1180 to the bottom end at 770. And so you can really, if you have a diverse group of students, you can have them reading at different lexile levels to accommodate and differentiate. Or you can have them reading at the level that you're really targeting for your grade. You also see that there's these Common Core aligned assessments, so giving students a chance to kind of engage with the kinds of questions that they're going to encounter when they get to Smarter Balance or PARCC assessments, because the types of questions that will appear on the Smarter Balance assessment and PARCC assessments are very different than some of the previous kinds of test questions that they may have encountered in their kind of lives as students and test takers. And so just giving them some familiarity with that is really, really helpful. Also, the more that they're able to do some digital reading online, they're able to build digital reading stamina. And if you haven't actually taken the time to sit down and go through some of the example questions on the Smarter Balance or the PARCC assessment, whichever one you're responsible for in your particular state, I would suggest doing it because it is pretty intense. The amount of reading students have to do, they really have to make sense of digital text, and most students aren't really used to engaging with digital text in a really active way. So they don't have that digital reading stamina, and they don't necessarily have the active reading skills that they need for the online space. So one of the things I talk about in my chapter on reading in my book is, for years, many of us have taught pen and paper annotation strategies. I know for my students, we go over, here are strategies you can use to annotate a literary text, and here are annotation strategies you can use for in the nonfiction or academic or informational text. And so students get used to, okay, here's what I can do when I'm engaging with the text to try to make sense of it. At my school, when we do reading, when we read an actual book, which we read a new text each 6-week grading period, we can't write in the books because we check them out from the library and we only have a limited supply. So my students, like this picture here is actually a picture of one of my students' books, they actually annotate directly directly in the books that on Post-it notes that we get from the library. And they're very used to this pen and paper annotation experience. But as we start shifting and they start consuming more digital text, it becomes increasingly important that we give them the tools and the opportunities to practice applying those annotation strategies, those close reading and active reading strategies in the online environment. And so one of the tools I've really enjoyed using, because I can use it with any online web page or resource online, is Diigo. All of my students sign up for their own Diigo account. It is free, and I can literally hyperlink to an article from our class webpage and say, hey, I want you to read this article from Scientific America, or hey, I want you to read this article from the Wall Street Journal on tiger mothers. It's an excerpt that I want you to read, and here's what I want you to do with it. I want you to annotate it, make notes, and then share it with me. And so instead, in the past, if I found an article online I wanted students to read, I'd print it out, I'd make a bunch of copies, I'd pass it out in class, we'd read it together, they'd annotate it, maybe they'd take it home and finish the annotations, they'd give it to me, I'd collect it, I'd assess it, I'd enter it into the grade book. And that's just a lot of energy. Now I find an article I love, I hyperlink from my website, my students annotate it using Diigo, and then they just click share and share it with my email address. So I can give them more experience finding articles, nonfiction articles, informational articles online, and give them a strategy to process it. Sometimes this is Diigo overlaid with Newsela, same article you saw before in my previous example, but if I want students to annotate it, they can use their Diigo tool. They just click the icon right next to their tool or their URL, their browser bar window, and then they can actually highlight sections of the text that seem really interesting or have great information. And then they can also leave notes asking questions, making connections, summarizing key ideas that are in the text. And then all the annotations, all of the highlights that they make are saved automatically to their Diigo account, and at any point they can log into Diigo.com with their account information, and they can see every single article that they have read and annotated. They see the article title, the URL, the highlighted sections, as well as any notes that they've made, and it's really easy. They can make those notes private, or they can share them with other students if they're working collaboratively on an assignment, or they can share them with me. And then instead of kind of amassing all this paper, I'm literally just toggling through the emails that they've shared with me. Another tool that I use to give them more experience annotating literary and nonfiction texts is StudySync. So StudySync has this enormous digital library of excerpts of really popular texts as well as really contemporary literary texts, poetry, there are famous speeches, there's excerpts from plays and nonfiction pieces. And what I like about using StudySync is I, for years, have been kind of chained to the titles that live in our book room on campus. And now I'm no longer limited to those texts. They're constantly adding new titles to StudySync. So I have all of these different texts that I can use either as my primary text if I want to do a series of short stories, or if I want to do a poetry unit, or if I want to focus on several different excerpts of different texts focused on World War II, as opposed to trying to just teach one of the texts that's in the library. I've also used StudySync to supplement the text that we are reading. So when we read of Mice and Men, we'll also read other pieces that John Steinbeck has written, or we'll read about the Dust Bowl. We'll take a look at some of those images of the people who are living during the Dust Bowl, which is so great to give students some real experience with nonfiction texts that are going to enhance their understanding of the books that we're reading. What's also super helpful is I don't have access to a computer lab in my classroom, but on my school campus we do have 2 computer labs, and so as much as possible we'll do real-time StudySync activities and assignments where students can engage in real time and fill those kind of experience those lessons, which are really dynamic because they have everything from video to a read where they can read the text or they can listen to audio, they can answer questions about the text, they can do a writing assignment, and in this way I'm able to lend support as they're actually working on it, which is kind of fun. But they actively can read using StudySync, and I did spend some time going through the Smarter Balance assessment, and as I was going through the Smarter Balance assessment for 11th grade, I was kind of surprised and super relieved that the annotation tool within the Smarter Balance assessment is very similar to the annotation tool that my students use when they're completing their StudySync assignments. So these are all different texts that my students have read that complement kind of some of the primary texts we're reading or take in the place of some of those primary texts. And as students open them up, they go into, so for example, the first inaugural address, FDR's first inaugural address, they go in and they have the annotation tools. So they can highlight the elements of the speech that they felt were really poignant or interesting. And then they can also make annotation notes. They can identify key vocabulary. They can try to figure out what are the central themes in this particular speech, and they can review their annotations, and I can review their annotations at any time and see exactly what notes they made as they read, so I can make sure that they really are transferring those active reading skills from pen and paper to this online environment. And I don't think kids will get to exams like Smarter Balance and automatically apply their pen and paper annotation strategies if they haven't had opportunities to read digital text and annotate them online. So I appreciate that StudySync gives me such a parallel experience so that hopefully when my students get to the Smarter Balance assessments, they're not feeling anxiety. They feel confident, they know what they're doing. Another strategy I use to kind of get creative with the Common Core is students really need to, in addition to kind of reading closely to determine both explicit and implicit meaning of the text, they also have to learn how to start identifying that strong evidence, the kind of evidence that they would use to support what they're writing or anything that they're kind of talking about in terms of their speaking and listening and discussions. And so we went to the computer lab and we were reading Lord of the Flies, and I asked my students, I said, okay, I want you to choose a character and I want you to describe that character in your own words in a couple of sentences, but then I want you to back up that description with textual evidence. I want a direct quote from the text, and I want that cited properly with MLA in text citations. And what was cool about this activity is I could have done this on a handout. Everybody could have done it on a piece of paper, but the fact that they were doing it on a shared Padlet wall changed the entire experience. So Padlet is like a virtual Post-it note board where students can click on the link. They can all get to this same Padlet wall with the kind of bamboo background, which I chose. It comes with all kinds of really beautiful backgrounds, or you can actually upload your own images, which is kind of cool. And then as they work, it actually refreshes in real time so students can see what other students are adding to the wall. And so over the course of about 15 or 20 minutes, every student ended up adding their character description, pulling out textual evidence and adding it to the wall. And then at the end of the activity, I was able to shift the wall from a can write wall where everybody could write on it to a can view wall so that everybody could read what their peers had posted to the wall. And even though they just focused on one particular character for their description, they're learning about all these other characters and learning from kind of the collective intelligence that's in the room, because we're really crowdsourcing our ideas in a space where everybody can see them. So Padlet, I love it. It's such an easy tool to use and a nice way to really have fun with pulling out textual evidence and starting to identify what is strong textual evidence, what does it look like, how can we use it to support our statements, our ideas. The next section is really focused on the writing standards, and the writing standards also have some key shifts that I think are worth covering. So in the Common Core, for English teachers, there's actually 3 types of writing that we're required to teach: argumentative, informative, and narrative. Now, the science and history and technical studies section of the ELA standards mirror that, but the history, science, and technical studies are really focused primarily on argumentative and informative writing. There is a little caveat, though, because they say that in that argumentative and informative writing, students need to weave narrative elements throughout. So really, they do have to be aware of narrative elements and be able to use them in their writing, but history, science, and technical studies teachers don't actually have to teach narrative. They're really focused on argumentative and informative. There's this focus on not just writing on paper anymore, but also being able to use the online environment to produce and publish and collaborate on written pieces, which is a really interesting shift. Students need to know how to write for different audiences and for a particular purpose. And I think that as we consider how many options students have for publishing now with the internet, whether they're publishing a blog or whether they're creating a digital portfolio, all of a sudden they have an audience that is far bigger than just their teacher, which I love because that's such an incentive for them to do their best work. And so getting them to recognize that they might have a very different audience for this piece as opposed to this piece, or maybe the purpose of this writing is very different from the purpose of this writing over here. Those are interesting distinctions to start making and helping students kind of wrap their minds around. Research is all over the English language arts section of the Common Core. In fact, if you do a search of the ELA section, the word research appears 80 times. So clearly this ability to both find information, assess the credibility, and then use that information to support statements and writing is key. But it's not just formal research. Informal research also has a place in the Common Core because a lot of the research students are doing to answer questions is fairly quick and informal. And then of course students need to use technology to collaborate, produce, and publish their writing. And just like the reading standards, the writing standards act as a staircase. So each kind of level builds on the next, and I've pulled out writing standard 0.6, which has got the technology component really embedded in it. So if you look at kindergarten through second grade, even at that young age, with guidance and support from adults, they need to be using a variety of digital tools to produce and publish writing, including in collaboration with peers. By the time we get to third to sixth grade, all of a sudden the word the internet comes in, and so students are using technology, including the internet, to publish and produce writing, as well as interact and collaborate with peers. By sixth to eighth grade, they're using the internet to produce and publish, but now they're also learning how to do things like hyperlink to information and embed information into their writing. By ninth to 10th grade, they're using technology and the internet to produce, publish, and then update both individual and shared writing projects and take advantage of technology's ability to really link to information and to display information flexibly and dynamically. And then by 11th and 12th grade, they're really refining these skills, but they are also now kind of responding to ongoing feedback. So there's this real idea that writing is no longer over when you submit a paper, but it's this kind of ongoing experience where you can revise and edit and keep your writing really relevant. One thing I like about the writing standards also is I think it gives us a chance to kind of honor some of the different kinds of writing that students do in their lives beyond the classroom. So I've used study sync blasts, which are very much like a Twitter engagement where students have a topic. This one was called Creepy Crawlies, and I actually, when we were doing Lord of the Flies, I had them do this study sync blast. It was a listen edition blast, which means it had this little public radio listen edition component that they could listen to, so they're absorbing information in media beyond just text. It has some background information. It has research links. So embedded in this really cool activity is not only text information, but also audio component, and you have this opportunity to kind of cultivate some research skills. And then students consider a question like, what do you think of insects as the next food craze? Can you imagine eating insects? Because clearly, if you have a bunch of boys living on an island like Lord of the Flies, you get into that survival mode. And so it was an interesting question for students to consider. And then they had to blast out their response in 140 characters or less. And that's really tricky. And we think about the importance of social media in a lot of our lives. I won't say all, but a lot of our lives. Learning how to articulate yourself in 140 characters is definitely becoming a skill students need to learn. And what I love about the StudySync blasts in particular is that students can access them from a phone or an iPad, or they can share devices, and the experience is exactly the same. So for me in my BYOD classroom, where I don't have a lot of access to hardware that's my own, I'm able to capitalize on what my students bring into the classroom to get them kind of doing some of these more kind of concise, short pieces of writing that mirror the kind of interactions that many of them are having on social media. And hopefully what we do in the classroom will bleed over into their lives outside the classroom, so they become a little bit more articulate in expressing themselves in a really small amount of characters. Another really fun opportunity for cultivating this more informal social media style communication and getting them, producing and publishing snippets of writing, and also kind of collaborating, because there's a social component along, with a StudySync blast or a Twitter conversation, is KQED Do Now. So KQED has this Do Now series where they basically present a bunch of questions. And so each week the questions alternate between science topics and kind of current event topics, and they ask students to consider a question. For example, this one says, should we kill one species to save another? And then students are invited to have a global education Twitter chat about this topic. And the Twitter feed streams on the side here, and below this question, there's information about the topic. So it's not just a question, but students really get to engage in an experience. So this Do Now topic is about, should we use hydrogen fuel, in the future? Should it be our future energy source for transportation? And then, they always have a picture because students are so visual, which I love. And then below it, you'll even see, for those teachers who are a little freaked out using Twitter, they have, for more information on how to use Twitter, click here. So there's even embedded resources for teachers to help them facilitate Twitter conversations that are safe and respectful with their students. Then the Do Now question is articulated, and then you have this kind of introduction to the topic, which is basically information that's been curated and vetted by KQED to give students a little kind of window into the topic. There's usually a video of some kind that students can watch about the topic, so that, again, they're getting information both text and in the visual kind of video media form. And at the bottom, they have even more resources that students can use to investigate this topic of hydrogen fuel and other fuel sources. Is this the way to go for the future? Which I love, because as a teacher, we don't always have time to vet a whole bunch of different links, but at the same time, students aren't very good at researching. They definitely need practice and support learning how to find credible information. So if you were thinking, gosh, that sounds cool, but I would never, I don't know if I'd want to do Twitter with my students, I also encourage teachers, take a look at the Do Now series of questions. There's quite an archive actually now, so great questions to choose from. And most of them are laid out so that they lend themselves to argumentative writing. So you can actually take one of these topics, and you could use the Twitter conversation as a kind of pre-writing where students get to engage with kids all over the world and bounce ideas around, or you could just use it as a way to drive a piece of argument writing where students are really kind of exploring an issue and then taking a stand on that issue. And so at the beginning of the year, I do what I call writing boot camp, and so we'll tackle a few of these topics, and I use them as an excuse to teach them how to format their argument writing. So we start really small. Well, we'll take a Do Now topic, and then I will give them a template that I've created using a Google Doc, and I'll have them, go through the information on the Do Now site and explore the research links, and then construct a solid argument paragraph in response to that question. And I'm a big fan of using Google Documents as a way to scaffold writing, because students, particularly at 9th and 10th grade, the focus is on structure. Teaching them how to just format a solid piece of writing is kind of the challenge. And so I will, in my own Gmail, my Google Docs, I will create one template like you see here, kind of this little screenshot of it. And in the left-hand side, I will literally go through and name each sentence and describe what that sentence does. And then in the right-hand side is where students can actually write the drafts of their argument writing to make sure they're not skipping any of the important parts of the argument paragraph. And for me, once I've created the template, because it's a Google document and all of my students have Gmail. I don't collect any paper for my students anymore, which is amazing and freeing, and I love it. So I'll link from our class website to this template and allow students to make a copy of it and then use it to guide their writing. Alternatively, I could use a script like Doctopus and pre-populate all of their Google Drives with this template so that they could use it. So just a way to support them through the writing process. And then as they write, I really, as much as possible, like to get them into a computer lab during the phase, like kind of the middle section of their writing assignment, and they sit at the desk and they continue writing and working on their essays in real time. And I sit in front of the room and I actually open up every single document that has been shared with me for that writing assignment, and then I go through and edit them in real time. And it's very powerful to be on a student's document with them as they're writing, because you can catch things and clean up mistakes so quickly and easily. And then if they're really struggling, I'm right there in the room. I can walk over and answer questions and give them some guidance. So you'll see on this screencast of a real-time editing session that I did, I was in the computer lab, and you'll see all of the tabs that are open at the top of this screen. Those were all documents where the student had started a document, they had titled it properly, they had shared it with me, and that they had done some of the writing. And at this point, for this particular assignment, they had to do the introduction and the body paragraph, because I really wanted to clean up any mistakes. And so I was able to really work one-on-one with the kids and give them really focused, guided feedback. I also use Google Docs and kind of the grading ability within it to go through at the end of students' work and give them kind of those real specific feedback, that real specific feedback on their finished product. I use a combination of Doctopus and Gubrick, which actually on my blog, catlintucker.com, I think not my last blog, but the one before, I've talked about how you use those, and I embedded some great videos on how you use Doctopus and Gubrick, because it's really a nice way to streamline your assessing of student writing online, because you're able to go through essays, give feedback, and then complete a rubric that's attached to the document. Actually ends up getting embedded into the document, which is really cool. So just another way to kind of take that pen and paper writing and grading experience and moving it to the online space to make it a little bit more effective and efficient of a process for teachers who are looking to kind of move into the digital space. I also love using StudySync for peer reviews. So I can only get into the document so many times as a student is working, and it's really helpful to allow students the opportunity to give each other feedback. So one of the things that I've enjoyed doing is having students at some point in the process of their writing post a section of writing to a write assignment, where they will write their thesis statement and then maybe a first body paragraph. And they'll submit it on StudySync, and then students are able to give each other anonymous peer reviews where they highlight what's been done well, what needs improvement. And so if you look at the editing and revising section of the Common Core, students need to know how to edit and revise their work to improve it. But sometimes it's hard for teachers to get in there and give students all of the guidance that they need. And sometimes I feel like our kids are really underutilized resources. is. So the more we can kind of structure peer reviews and peer edits, the more successful those are going to be, and the more successful students will be at editing and revising their own work. And so finally, I want to talk about speaking and listening really quickly. And the speaking and listening standards are really interesting because just like the reading and the writing standards, there's this gradual development in what students need to be able to do, from just learning to speak audibly and express thoughts clearly in kindergarten and first grade, to telling a story and speaking audibly in coherent sentences, even beginning to kind of record audio recordings of stories and poems by second grade, or more engaging audio recordings by third to fifth grade. And then by the time you get to high school, they have to be able to present information really clearly and concisely and logically, and then use both audio and visuals in their presentations to enhance what they're saying. And so for me, my students have always struggled in the classroom with real-time discussion prior to me using online discussions. So it was really when I started shifting conversations to the online environment first that the in-class conversations really started to flourish. So I used Schoology as our online discussion space, and students have conversations online about the literature we're reading. We have icebreakers online as well. And then once they've had a chance to flush out their ideas online, have conversations, throw ideas around, they're much more willing to engage with each other in real time. So every single day after we've had an online discussion, we come into the classroom and we do what I call four-corner conversations, where I break students up into 4 smaller groups, and they literally go to one of the 4 corners of our classroom. They sit in a circle, everybody on the same level, and they have a conversation about the online discussion and about the reading. What questions do they have? What points did they read about or they see in the online space in our online discussions that they thought were really interesting or they want to continue discussing? And students are just so much more comfortable because they've already had a chance to think about the questions presented online, consider their response to it, articulate a response, and get feedback from their peers. By the second semester of school, I like to have students leading these 4-corner conversations. So one of the things I do to have them prepare for them is I say, okay, you have your online discussions, you did your reading, now craft a strong dynamic discussion question you want to use in class to facilitate this small group discussion. And so kids submit questions, and then I kind of choose the strongest ones, or I choose kind of an array of them, and then the students learn how to lead the conversations, how to drive them, how to draw their peers into the discussion if people are kind of being shy or not contributing, which I think is a really important skill, because if you look at the speaking and listening, they have to prepare for and participate in small group, large group, teacher-led, student-led conversations. Now, what I love about 4-corner conversations is there are such vibrant conversations. Most students are contributing, but it's hard for me to kind of catch what everybody's saying and all of the great points that are being made. So at the end of 4-corner conversations, quite frequently, I will tell my students, okay, go into the quad, leave me a message. They can either call my Google Voice phone number, or they can record a voice memo on a single device for their group, and they can tell me, what were the highlights of your conversation? What do you have questions about? What are you excited to know more about? And then I get these recordings that I can listen to kind of when I have time to direct the next day's instruction. So students really see that their feedback, their ideas are kind of helping me to steer the course of the classroom. Now, there's a lot of information and there's a lot of different tools and strategies that I've just kind of thrown at you, and depending on where you are in like the spectrum of integrating technology, if you're kind of in the beginning stages, my advice would be try not to get too overwhelmed. You know, think big, but start small. So if during the webinar you heard 3 different tools you'd love to try one first, and be patient with yourself because you're going to make mistakes. It probably won't be super smooth the first time you try a tool. I encourage teachers to celebrate mistakes. Too often we feel like we have to get it right the first time, which is a lot of pressure. And it's in those moments where we make a mistake or something doesn't go right that we have the opportunity to grow and figure out, okay, next time this is how I'll do this better. whenever possible, if you're trying a new tool, be honest with kids. I've never done this before. I'd love for you guys to kind of take the lead. If you run into a bump, problem solve, troubleshoot, ask each other. So make students resources in the classroom. And then if you're using technology, I mean, we all have so much on our plate as educators. It's key that we use technology to replace and improve what we already do. So not to stack on top of our already overflowing plate, but to really think about, okay, I'm going to use this piece of technology to replace this activity or to improve this activity, to make it more effective, to engage students more effectively. And these are the two books. Blended Learning in Grades 4 through 12 is the book that I wrote, really about blending online learning with face-to-face instruction, even in a low-tech classroom. And then I co-authored Creating a Google Apps Classroom with a couple other, or a collection of other really phenomenal Google certified teachers. And again, I'm totally accessible on Twitter or my education blog, catlintucker.com, if you want to get in touch with me after today's webinar, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thanks, Catlin. Pulling up questions now. And we have a couple that we marked here. Let's see. Jim was asking, in reference to StudySync, are the text in HTML? He states that their Chromebooks don't read Word.
No, HTML.
HTML, okay. Great, great. And then let me see. A couple people are asking about the recording, and yes, we're going to be sending the recording out to everyone following the webinar a few days after, in a link and a follow-up email. Suzanne's asking, is StudySync free? And if you want to speak to that, or we can.
I know that it's not free, but you might be able to give more specifics than I can.
So it is not free for the full program of StudySync. However, on the StudySync website, there is the ability to sign up for a free trial. So we can include that link in the follow-up email as well for everyone. There's a free 60-day trial of StudySync on the website. So if you go to studysync.com, there's a big orange Start Your Free Trial button, and you guys can check it out. So great way to kind of check it out without fully committing.
Yeah, it's an awesome tool. So if you have someone at your district or your school site that you can kind of poke and have them explore it with you, it's definitely a tool that kind of speaks for itself. I love it.
Gotcha, gotcha. Suzanne is also asking, she was asking whether it was free or not. She goes, she's asking, she says Digo is free for the entire class, question mark. So I'm assuming that it is.
You can get, yeah, Digo's free. My students each just sign up for an individual account. You can get an educator's account. I haven't had a lot of luck with groups on Digo. I've just run into a bunch of little glitches with groups. So I just have all of my students start a Digo account, and then they use their Digo account to annotate, and then they share directly from their account to me, and it works seamlessly.
Great, great. Thanks for that.
Yeah.
Hey, Suzanne, as we're exiting today, there's a survey, so you may want to mark that you'd like to receive follow-up from a sales rep and just have a conversation about StudySync and maybe what we can do to help meet your needs in your class. So that would be a great opportunity to talk to somebody. So if anyone has any other questions, go ahead and type them in now. Oh, a few more just coming in. Awesome. Let's see. Wasita is asking us, I have struggling readers, and my challenge is helping them keep up with all their passwords. Do you keep all of them in one location for students? Great organization question.
Yeah, it is a great, and it's a really important one. You know, my kids are at high school, and so I'm not comfortable being in charge of all their passwords. Instead, we basically have encouraged them to have a Google document where they organize their account information, because we do have so many different accounts. So what's their username? I also give them a strategy for like creating passwords that are not the same for every site. And so those are just little kind of things I would cover with kids, because as much of it as it is a pain in the butt, I feel like my kids are really close to, ninth and 10th grade. They only have 2 more years, and then they're out in the world, and they need to learn this skill, because we all have all these passwords for different sites, and so how do they organize them? But with struggling readers, one thing that I didn't really mention is both on, on StudySync at least, you can actually go through and tailor your search for different texts based on Lexile level. So if you have lower level students who you're trying to pair texts that are going to be appropriate for that grade level, that's a really nice tool as well. And in addition to the Newsela that has the different Lexile levels, you also have that ability with StudySync to kind of filter by Lexile level.
Awesome, thank you. Let's see, we've got a couple more questions in here. Brittany's asking, I work in an inner city school where most of my students are lower level, and I don't have regular access to a computer, much less the internet. With such low-level students and limited technology access, what do you recommend would be the first way to integrate more technology into the classroom if they don't have access to computers before, during, or after class? So it sounds like Brittany's got a challenging situation there.
Yeah, it's hard if you don't even have access to a computer lab occasionally. There are ways to adapt a lot of this to pen and paper if you want to do like little bits online when you do have access, but if you don't have access at all, using web-based tools is going to be really challenging. And I don't have access in my classroom per se, like with hardware that lives there, but I do have probably a 1 device to every 2, 3, I think my lowest class is like 1 device to every 4 kids. So a lot of what I try to do is build in collaborative activities, but I do have access to the internet or like Wi-Fi on my school site. It's not great, but it works. And so it's been like key for me to be able to work in some of these tech tools.
Great. And Catlin, did you say you worked with your local like computer recycling center to get some like devices?
Yes.
Is that a strategy maybe she could try?
Yeah, I would definitely check out, see if you have a computer recycling site around you. And it was I only got 1 computer, but I haven't asked again. And I literally wrote an email and got the computer the next week. So a lot of them are willing to donate computers to classrooms.
Yeah, Brittany, that might be a good helpful thing for you to just get some more access to technology. Susie's asking, so I'm in Florida and we are just beginning. What small step is a good first step? So
I would say a really simple tool to use if you just want to try one of them would be either the Padlet wall, and having them, if they're doing reading in an actual text, to have them pull out like some examples or make predictions on a Padlet wall, because only the teacher needs an account and it's free for a Padlet wall, and the students just click the link and they can participate. Newsela is really low barrier to entry too, depending on how you set it up. So none of these tools are overly complex. I would say Schoology, because it's actually a learning management system, even though I only use it really for the discussion functionality, maybe has more things you have to learn to use it. But StudySync's pretty easy to learn. It's super easy to get students on. Padlet's really easy because you just have a teacher account, and Newsela is super easy as well. Google and Google Apps. I love Google. I use Google Apps for everything, but again, it's a little higher barrier to entry in terms of there's so much you can learn to use it.
Awesome, thank you. Question from Bonnie. Are you using a digital tool to track the standards as you include them in lesson plans?
I'm not tracking them per se. I do have is it called Core Connect? or Mastery Connect has an app that's on my phone. So oftentimes when I'm lesson planning or I'm trying to figure out what I want to do, I pull up that app on my phone and just kind of review the standards that I think I'm hitting. But I haven't I don't have a spreadsheet or anything necessarily where I'm keeping track of what I'm doing. I guess I could on a Google spreadsheet quite easily. I just haven't. Honestly, I find that I am teaching like with a single lesson, I'm hitting so many different standards at one time that I'm not really worried that I'm missing standards.
Great. So Dana's asking, I think she says towards the end of your presentation, you were talking about online and then the four-corner exercise. She wants to know what tool you were using for the online component.
Oh, that was Schoology. So Schoology
Okay.
is the tool I use for my online discussions, where I post the questions, students respond to the question, and they have to reply to at least 2 other students in the class online. And then when we come into the classroom, we follow up those online discussions with those four-corner kind of face-to-face conversations to really blend the online experience with the classroom experience.
Perfect. Thank you. So looks like that's all of the questions we have. And we just want to thank you, Catlin, for presenting today and sharing your knowledge with us and everybody here. As everybody leaves today, there's going to be an exit survey that I referenced earlier, just a quick five questions. And if you guys are interested in speaking to a sales rep or just having a quick strategy session with someone about how to improve what you're doing, just mark that on the way out, and then also let us know how we did so we can provide more sessions and better meet your needs through webinars as we're going forward. And if you have any questions, you can reach directly out to Catlin. She's got some info on the screen. Or you can email us directly if you like at webinars@mheducation.com. And we'll be sending the link in a follow-up email. And let me just double check one last time for any more questions. I think we have anything new? No? All right, people are saying thank you, so thank you to all the thank yous.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. It was my pleasure presenting.
Thank you so much. Take care, everyone.